Thank you, Mary. Okay, our next two speakers are actually joining us virtually. Um, First, we're going to have Brian Miller. Brian Miller is a conservation biologist with a PhD from the University of Wyoming, where he helped capture the last wild black-footed ferrets for a groundbreaking captive breeding program. His career spans reintroduction efforts in the US and Mexico, jaguar and puma research, and reserve design focused on keystone species. Co-founded the Wind River Ranch Foundation, now the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge, and has authored over 100 scientific articles and 6 books on wildlife conservation. And yeah, cool. Hey guys. All right, I will turn it
Does
over
it work?
to you, Brian. Yep.
Steve was also catching those last black-footed ferrets at Metisi. I want to talk a little bit about highly interactive species and why they're important. And the Endangered Species Act was based on the best science at the time, and it's still a vanguard document. It largely was based on the right of a species to exist. That was its core concept. But there have been a lot of advances, scientific advances since 1973, and the ESA needs to include a strong reference to species interactions that contribute, to the maintenance of ecological and species diversity. And indeed, when highly interactive species disappear, uh, there are changes in composition, structure, and diversity in the systems. And like all ecological variables, interaction strength depends on the place, the time, the season, and the history. The present definition of recovery under the Endangered Species Act typically ignores the role of species interactions. Instead, it emphasizes short-term, single species demographic presence, often in just a few isolated places. And the Act should consider keeping highly interactive or keystone species above their threshold for ecological effectiveness, not just presence in a few spots. The geographic range of such species should be as large as possible. And if a highly interactive species is limited by numbers and areas, even if they're still present, the interactions they support can be functionally extinct. So recovery should not be based just on physical presence in a few places, outdoor zoos, but on the restoration of ecological function. And common roles for highly interactive species are mutualism, like pollination, this bumblebee on the elephant head, uh, the role of predation in enforcing top-down trophic cascades, and the ability to alter habitat in a way that benefits a host of species. Highly interactive species have become victims of the ideology of dominating nature, and this is the engineering building at the University of Wyoming. It's not uncommon for highly interactive species to also be highly persecuted species. Highly interactive species push a system toward complexity and resilience, but for humans to profit economically, people need to simplify those systems so that they're easier to control and easier to exploit economically. If there's a conflict between profit and nature, profit wins and nature gets what's left over. Prairie dogs alter their habitat as ecological engineers. Unfortunately, prairie dogs now occupy about 3% of their former range, and their colonies are small and widely dispersed. And this is an example of being taxonomically present but functionally extinct. Prairie dog numbers and distributions are too limited for them to play their historic role, even if the remaining colonies are sufficient to allow survival of the prairie dogs in that colony. Humans played a strong role in limiting prairie dog distribution and abundance, first poisoning and then compounded by the introduction of plague, and that has decimated the species. There have been a war on native species like prairie dogs and for the benefit of an exotic species like livestock. Despite significant population decline and susceptibility to plague and a lack of regulatory mechanisms to manage and protect the species, prairie dogs are still largely unprotected. There are 5 conditions that the Endangered Species Act uses to judge the need for protection, and the species only needs to meet one of the criteria to warrant protection. The above 3 that I just mentioned, population decline, susceptibility to plague, lack of regulatory mechanisms, are all part of the criteria to assess whether a species needs protection or not. The other 2 of the 5 are overutilization for commercial purposes and other man-made factors, and those could also be applied to prairie dogs. And quite simply, they're not protected because the Fish and Wildlife Service lacks the political will to do it on the prairie grasslands. A century ago, 5 species of prairie dogs lived in a shifting mosaic of colonies that covered more than 40 million hectares, about 100 million acres on the Great Plains. And by 1960, prairie dog area had declined to about 600,000 hectares, largely because of poisoning campaigns, land conversion, and then the introduction of plague, which I think was around 1948. This was a decline in 98% by 1960, and the remaining colonies were small and isolated. Excuse me. Today, the prairie dog only occupies about 3% of the original territory, and that's a remaining range that is smaller than remnant old-growth forest. Prairie dogs play a key role in the maintenance of grasslands. They are a valuable food for many species of predators, and excuse me, they also decrease the density of woody shrubs and increase densities of grasses and forbs, thus creating conditions that large grazers prefer. Prairie dog activities also increase plant productivity, soil nitrogen, nutrient cycling, digestibility of grasses and forbs, and thus even when the biomass of a prairie dog colony is reduced, or the remaining biomass has a compensatory nutritional increase, which of course would vary from site to site. Their burrowing activity changes soil chemistry, increases soil porosity, soil turnover, and the organic content of the soils. Some species of plants, invertebrates, benefit from prairie dog activities, while other species benefit from the areas outside of the colony. So they increase beta diversity across a landscape. And excuse me. Estimating ecologically effective densities of prairie dogs is complicated by the introduction of plague. Plague reduces numbers and changes the temporal and spatial characteristic of the historic shifting mosaic between prairie dog colonies and grasslands. But despite the ambiguities, it's clear that ecologically effective densities of prairie dogs are far higher than the densities required for population persistence, as is the case with most highly interactive species. As an example, 1,000 hectares of prairie dogs may support 15,000 individual prairie dogs. And in the absence of plague, that number is high enough to support persistence of the colony. But a colony of that size, prairie dog colony of that size, may only support 12 to 15 black-footed ferrets. And that small of a number guarantees extirpation. Thus, conservative recovery goals that only consider single species population viability could maintain prairie dogs without providing sufficient resources for ferrets or other cohabiting species on the prairie dog ecosystem. And it's therefore essential that conservation practitioners have an ecological viewpoint that ensures the existence of highly interactive species at ecological densities and distributions that allow the species to exhibit their ecological function. Concentrating on such a goal would go much farther than trying to oppose single species management on each member of the community. And presently, black-footed ferrets and other species linked to prairie dog colonies are each managed as single species without enough emphasis on their dependence on the prairie dog. By protecting prairie dog, those species would be protected under the umbrella of the prairie dog ecosystem. And now it's Steve who is going to discuss the biology a little bit more. That's my plea for the need for highly interactive species to thrive, not just exist.
Thanks, Brian. I'll just read a quick bio for Steve and introduce Steve here. Steve Forrest holds degrees in forestry, environmental science, and law from Oregon State University, Yale, and University of Washington, respectively. He's authored or co-authored over 30 scientific publications on species, including black-footed ferrets, prairie dogs, bison, and penguins, most notably Prairie Night, on the rediscovery of the black-footed ferret. Former senior representative with Defenders of Wildlife and restoration science manager at WWF, he played a key role in founding American Prairie and continues his work through Prairie Wildlife Research and Oceanites Incorporated. Take it away, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh. I'm going to try to make just 3 points in my half of this talk today that I'll address as I go forward. But first is that public lands are very, very critical for the persistence of prairie dogs and are probably and were historically very important in terms of the prairie dogs that we have living today. As Brian mentioned, prairie dogs themselves have been reduced about 97%, but I'm willing to offer that the kind of ecosystem, prairie dog ecosystem that Brian described, those very large complexes of colonies probably are reduced by 99.5%. So we only have very few of these really ecologically functional concentrations of prairie dogs existent today, and those are found either on or in association with public lands. The second point is that, and I think you've been discussing this some today, there's a lot of public lands are kind of expanding in terms of what we think of beyond Forest Service lands or BLM lands, those federal public lands, at least with the ferret and prairie dog conservation work that I've been associated with. We have a lot of different public land forms, everything from state lands to actually city lands. The city of Fort Collins in Colorado has one of the larger prairie dog complexes left in Colorado now, and certainly tribal lands. Those are public lands. They're open to tribal members. It's not generally open to every citizen in the United States, but I think we have to consider those public lands. A lot of those tribal managers face a lot of the same issues that we face managing those public lands. And the third point I'd like to make, because it is basically an existential threat that the health of those lands has to be contingent upon the continued ownership in the public domain of those lands that we have, and that we need to, although we need to call to account those public land managers where they're not doing the best jobs that they might be able to do, that they're really important and they need to be funded. Prairie dog management and conservation is shockingly fairly expensive, mainly due to the issue of plague that Brian mentioned and controlling that, but also managing conflicts at the borders. But nonetheless, Megan Baxon from Western Watersheds is there amongst you at the conference today. She has been leading an effort at the Thunder Basin National Grassland in Wyoming to basically do the kinds of things that Brian has been discussing, and that is get the land managers there to reopen their lands to prairie dog management at a scale that's really functional and not simply allowing prairie dogs by themselves to persist on the land. So I would certainly catch Megan if you can while you're there. As Brian mentioned, 5 species of prairie dogs. Some of these large ecosystem functions are really more referent to at least the black-tailed prairie dog, which is this large area here. These are Gunnison's prairie dogs in the blue, white-tailed prairie dogs in the red. These species also occur at fairly large scales. The Utah prairie dog, which because your conference is in Utah, most of you may be familiar with, never was particularly numerous. They are endangered today. Some of this ecosystem discussion is probably less relevant in terms of how at scale they exist because they're just hanging on. And so some of the issues with Utah prairie dog and that red group Mexican prairie dog, which is also an endangered species, are a little bit different. We would just hope to keep those guys persisting on the landscape, and perhaps someday they might resume their ecosystem function. I can't get the... as Brian mentioned, prairie dogs very important in terms of their ecosystem role, and I won't go into that. As Brian mentioned, we got to have, we can't get too many shots of piles of dead prairie dogs. So the federal government was involved in a program to essentially eradicate prairie dogs at the turn of the land. So there was not an issue about control. That became very important as the numbers of prairie dogs, and here I show black-footed ferrets declining right along with prairie dogs from the early 1900s to about the early 1900s, when perhaps they reached the nadir, and we thought ferrets were extinct. It was pretty clear to early naturalists that that this program of extermination of prairie dogs was probably not, something was wrong with that. And anyway, it led to kind of, it's one of the earliest efforts at nationwide conservation of a species. At that time, the American Bison Society was quite active, but naturalists like Ernest Thompson Seton were quite vocal about advocating on behalf of restraint because it was the federal government's intention to completely wipe the prairie dog off the face of the earth as they were regarded as a nuisance. A lot of this changed after World War II. We had a number of international efforts in terms of looking at particularly this species, the black-footed ferret. I would hazard to say that if there was not interest in ferrets, we probably wouldn't have prairie dogs today, except in zoos or as small exhibits. The interest in the decline of the ferret was a quite novel phenomenon. We had seen the disappearance of the passenger pigeon about the early 1900s. People kind of still were not clear in the early 1950s about what might have caused all of that. It was sort of an unimaginable issue, but the bison, as an example, also led then credence to the loss of prairie dogs and the known association of ferrets with prairie dogs to take up quite an aggressive interest in ensuring that remaining prairie dogs were at least at that time looked at in terms of, are there ferrets there? And is there any need for us to conserve ferrets? Of course, we had the early efforts at the Endangered Species Act in the 1960s, the precursor to the 73 Act. Ferrets were adopted initially in that initial group in the 60s, and so they provided some umbrella protection for prairie dogs. So we kind of look at ferrets again as an umbrella species. We've got prairie dogs as a keystone species, but that at that time was not recognized as such. As Brian said, this is kind of data from Montana, southeast Montana. Just to give you some idea, you can see those acreage classes basically in the lower sort to the left of that graph. Probably 80% of those colonies are 100 acres or less. And as Brian mentioned, you know, we kind of, if you see prairie dogs living in the barrow pits off I-80 in Denver, or in a suburb out of Cedar City, Utah, you might say, well, they seem to be able to live everywhere, and there shouldn't be much worry about them. But as Brian mentioned, it's this ecosystem role and this interactive functional role that's really important. And the fact that 80% of the colonies, and this is pretty typical range wide in the black-tailed prairie dog range, it just an indication that we really don't have much left in terms of those large interactive colonies. Obstacles, as Brian mentioned, poisoning. In the old days, back when they were making those piles of prairie dogs, they were using strychnine. Strychnine, of course, got called to account through various publications during the 60s. Rachel Carson was very influential. A woman named Faith McNulty wrote "Why Must They Die?" Called out the use of strychnine, which was in fact used throughout the animal damage control years to control a host of predatory species, eagles, ravens. Everything was killed. It was a terrible toxicant, mainly because it had secondary effects. So that a predator eating an animal that had consumed strychnine would also get poisoned from the strychnine bait. So early in the 60s and 70s, the toxicants moved to zinc phosphide. It has been a pretty good actor in terms of the secondary toxicities. But then in the early 2000s, a company called Lipotech got a Rosol, which is was initially developed to control pocket gophers, got it licensed for the control of prairie dogs. Now Rosol, now we're back to this toxicant with secondary toxicities. It's a really bad actor. The Fish and Wildlife Service attempted to oppose the licensure of this pesticide for prairie dogs, to little success. It's in use today, and is not a very good, as I say, not a very good actor. But why does poisoning still occur? Well, I'll offer up this a bit, and that is historically, if you look at that green line, we had as Brian said, a very large mosaic spread over a large, millions of acres of grassland. But we had a lot of highly grazed areas and prairie dogs were a part of that group in that really short stature vegetation mode. We had probably about an equal amount in the, say, if you want to call it the medium grazed group. And then we had a lot of stuff that didn't get grazed. And so over time, we've got species that are adapted to all of those grassland conditions. The guys out on those extremes today are the ones that you look at that are in trouble. And when we look at, McConn's long spurs and some of those grassland species that require different types of stature. And we kind of can blame to some degree sort of this good grazing management, take half, leave half paradigm that evolved in the 60s and 70s. To get land managers to try to shift away from some of these other stature grass types. Some of that motivates poisoning. I will say in favor of some of the national grasslands, they have recognized the need to supply that range of diverse grass structure. And they've been trying to do that and get away from this kind of middling stuff. There are species that do well in that middle ground, but the more interesting species in my mind occupy those extremes. And this may have been at least part of the motivation for even today getting prairie dogs off the land to avoid that short structured grassland. But the big deal, of course, is perceived and real competition for forage with livestock. I won't go into all the pros and cons or the various arguments. There are times of year where livestock or all large ungulates are attracted to prairie dog colonies because of, as Brian mentioned, the forbs, much more nutrient filled, much more densely packed, and really good returns and weight gains on all kinds of large ungulates grazing on prairie dog towns in the spring. If you're trapped there, though, through the entire growing season, then things kind of tail off. And of course, that's when folks with fixed tenure on a very small land ownership base get into trouble, because then there may be, in fact, a loss of weight gain for some commercial livestock over that time. So we've kind of got this system where we could do really a lot better if we had a different kind of grazing regime where we took livestock off of those colonies and could put them somewhere else. But unfortunately, the land tenure system and the allotment system on the national grasslands, those pastures, if you will, are too small. And we can't take advantage of a large mosaic of grazing types and move those livestock onto more grass-filled areas. So that's just simply the way it is. These constituencies that do have permits on the national grasslands, in particular, in the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Colorado, they're very entrenched and powerful, multi-generational families in most cases. So they have a lot of sway in terms of directing the management intensity on those grasslands, and they often are demanding of poisoning quite often. We've also got increasing droughts on the grasslands, particularly in the Great Plains. Multi-year droughts now. Prairie dogs, just like any other grazing animal, they need grass, so they'll expand. It's usually probably about this. They're at much lower densities, but they do expand, and this creates conflict when they run into boundaries. We've got influential pesticide manufacturers, Lipotec, that was able to push through a licensure for Rosol when it had very well documented secondary toxicities to particularly predators. We've got cultural norms at work that folks have been doing it for generations. It's good husbandry. It's good management in their view to get out there and get after your very messy prairie dog and clean that up. So, and that's really difficult to overcome in a lot of these circumstances. And then we've got this perhaps somewhat legitimate issue with boundary control. It doesn't matter how many prairie dogs or area you have designated to contain prairie dogs. Eventually, they're going to reach the boundary and encounter a different kind of land tenure, and they will then come into conflict with a neighbor, whoever that is, whether it's another neighboring rancher, a city suburb, or what have you. Eventually you get into conflicts at boundaries. And so poisoning has often been used to mitigate those boundary conflicts.
Hey, Steve.
Brian mentioned plague. Plague is a killer. It's new, and this is the big cost of managing prairie dogs. Is we've got to get folks out there. It costs about $25 an acre to manage plague. It's put out, an insecticidal dust is put down the burrows. It kills the fleas that carry the plague bacillus. It's very effective at doing that. If we don't do that, even though there are some impacts to other insects, we often see complete and total collapse of these prairie dog colonies. Often it takes 15 to 20 years for them to recover. So it's, at least in terms of maintaining habitat for animals like the black-footed ferret, it's a game ender should we have an outbreak, catastrophic outbreak. So this is, we spend a lot of time administering insecticides to burrows. There's some new methods in the works in terms of allowing prairie dogs to eat a topical insecticide that would keep fleas off of them. So would reduce the cost quite a bit, but that's still in the works. And Brian didn't mention this, but shooting is unbelievably disruptive to prairie dog dynamics. If you go on the web, you will see, I think the last I counted, there were 600 to 1,000 folks sharing their adventures in the Great Plains, popping prairie dogs. They shoot off thousands, literally thousands of rounds of high velocity ammunition per outing. You can imagine the lead deposition that's involved with this, but that's the least of the problems in terms of prairie dogs are concerned. It not only disrupts their population dynamics, but it disrupts their behavior. They're reluctant to come out and feed. They produce fewer pups. And all of that has impacts down the road. So shooting is a big deal.
Hey, Steve, we have to wrap up because we got to get to our next speaker. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Apologize for that.
And that's a problem. And we'll just jump ahead. This is a map of the last of those big ecosystems that Brian was talking about in terms of their this is where they would be. And if all of them almost are all associated with public lands. So you can see this is a map of South Dakota. We've got two large aggregations of tribal lands, Badlands Wall, Wind Cave National Park. Again, Montana, these are BLM lands. I would say, what can we do? We can work to land consolidation. This is the Kanata Basin National Grassland. You can see the difference between 2024 and 2004. This has been amazing in terms of reducing conflicts. I would say acquire adjacent lands through conservation buyers, eliminate and regulate shooting on public lands, eliminate use of rosal. It's important to note most of these public lands do prohibit rosal, but there are some lands adjacent to them that don't. As Brian mentioned, we need large ecosystem reserve system, support public land managers in terms of their plague mitigation, and at all costs, let's avoid divestiture because there can't be healthy public lands with no public lands. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. And I will give a very quick introduction to Mark Searles, who is the Colorado coordinator for Project Coyote.
All right, thanks. Can everyone